Hi, this is Western Civ 1. I'm Dr. Young. Um, Today we're going to be uh, beginning the first of two lectures on the period known as the Late Middle Ages. And chronologically, this is roughly the time between about 1300 and about 1500. And there are various titles that can be applied to this period. One of the most common is the Renaissance, but that term, problematic as it is, and in the next lecture, actually, I'll talk about how problematic that term is. But it really only applies to certain phenomena that we see in this period, and so we want to set this in a much broader kind of context um, and really use this nondescript term, the Late Middle Ages, which is really the historian's preference at this point in time. Now, the 14th century in particular has been seen as a time of trouble. Lots of kind of disturbing things happening in Europe in this period. We're going to talk about the Black Death and some wars and some other things that really irrevocably altered the society and culture of Europe, or at least cast a very long shadow over the next several centuries. But I fear that this may be somewhat misleading because this period was not characterized entirely by just really terrible things happening, by natural and man-made disasters. Like late antiquity, which we studied earlier in the semester, this period has its own momentum, must be understood on its own terms, and really is sort of the chronological home of some very important trends in the history of Western civilization. So we will try to comment on some of those things, but I fear that from what I've prepared here, we're going to talk a lot about really tragic things happening in Europe. Q, in fact, what is arguably the greatest disaster in the history of Western civilization, which is the Black Death. But there were, in fact, some disasters that preceded that. Climate scientists working together with historians have, first of all, understood that around the year 1300, there began, I should say, a fairly rapid period of global cooling. We today, of course, are in the midst of global warming, and this is advancing every year. Scientists come out and say this is the warmest year on record, or it's one of the 10 warmest years on record, or something like that. If there were meteorologists around in the early 14th century, they would have noted that these were years where the temperatures were dropping worldwide at a fairly precipitous rate. And one of the first effects this had on human societies was to cause severe damage to agriculture in Europe. There were a few years in the 13 teens, for instance, when there was a lot of rain during the summers. The temperatures were much cooler than normal. The growing seasons were thus significantly shorter, and this led to a series of famines. It didn't occur all over Europe at the same time. There were famines in northern Europe, and then there were famines in the Mediterranean area in years following that. But let's recall that in the Middle Ages, farmers pretty much lived on the edge of their existence. At least some of them did. We've talked about peasants and about agricultural innovations and things like this. Well, all of that was well and good because it allowed, the new plow and the crop rotation and the use of horse as a draft animal and some of these other things allowed more and more land to be put into cultivation, and this spurred a population growth that was tremendous and which accounts for a lot of the vitality of the High Middle Ages. However, in the early 14th century, those lands which had been marginal and still cultivated ceased to be productive because of the global cooling, because of the rapid climate change and the famines that followed from that. And so this this series of famines in the 13 teens and early 1320s has become known as the Great Famine. Numerous sources from the period talk about the increasing desperation that people felt as they were starving to death. Most peasants did not have any kind of surplus of food, any kind of food stocks or stores. There was no refrigeration in this period, of course, and so, they got desperate. If their crops didn't grow one year, they really had nothing to eat unless they either decided to eat their seed grain, which meant they had nothing to plant in the earth the next year, or they decided to slaughter their animals, which meant that they didn't have anything to pull the plow, right? But these were the desperate straits that some people ended up in. There are even reports from this period of cannibalism. That's how desperate people got. Now, there has been a correlation drawn by some historians between the effects of the Great Famine, which, I think modern epidemiological studies will bear this trend out, that if people are born during a time of scarcity and they don't get sufficient nutrition as children, that their overall constitution is weakened. By the time they become adults, they are not as healthy as they would have otherwise been, right? And so I don't think it's coincidental that about a generation after the Great Famine, we have the Black Death, right? Now, the Black Death is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, a strain of bacterium, and this is a particular mutation of that strain that became deadly. Did the weakened constitution of this generation of Europeans contribute to the rapid spread of the Black Death? Well, I'm not an epidemiologist. I can't say that for sure, but the correlation has been made by other people, and I think that I think common sense probably bears that out. Anyway, the Black Death is the greatest natural disaster, arguably, not just in the history of Western civilization, but in human history. And it affected more than just Europe. The Black Death probably began in East Asia and spread along with the Mongols, who were at the time still, in the 13th century, they began conquering other parts of the world, coming from, of course, Mongolia. They conquered China. They made their way down into the Middle East. Many of them converted to Islam and sort of were assimilated into Middle Eastern culture. Some groups of Mongols came over into Eastern Europe and began conquering there. And so there was this, kind of widespread Mongol presence for a century or more. And it may be via those kind of transportation routes that the Black Death spread. By the mid-1340s, this was in Constantinople, and then from there into other major trading centers, or rather around the same time, major trading centers like Baghdad and Beirut and Cairo. And in late 1347, this spread probably via Constantinople to Italy, given that the Italians were, involved in trade in Constantinople. It probably spread on Italian ships coming from that city. When it got to Europe, it spread rapidly. Okay, now let's talk about the pathological nature of this disease. It is caused by a strain of bacteria called Yersinia pestis, as I said. But this bacterium normally finds its way into the intestinal tracts or the gastrointestinal tracts of vermin like fleas, which live on various mammals. Okay, the flea can live on rats, for instance. It can also live on human beings. Humans and rats lived in close proximity to each other in the Middle Ages. And truth be told, we still live in fairly close proximity to rats. It's estimated that in every city, even in the Western world, there are probably as many rats as there are human beings, and they tend to live in walls and attics and basements, in subways and other things. They actually are closer to us probably than many of us would like to admit, given that the rat tends to be a creature of some revulsion, right? Apologies to any of you who may have pet rats. I'm sure they make wonderful pets. In any case, this is not conclusive because there really is no evidence of a lot of dead rats in the Middle Ages. So this may not be a case of the fleas jumping from rats to humans and vice versa. The rats may not have been affected by this, and so the pathology is still open for debate in any case, right? But the plague is caused by this bacterium, and this seems to have mutated in the 14th century, become particularly deadly for human beings. Now, the way that this thing works pathologically is it gets into the various systems of the body. Maybe most commonly it gets into the lymphatic system and causes a coagulation of lymph in the lymph nodes. You can see from the illustration here a person afflicted with plague who has a swelling in the lymph nodes in their groin, right? They also tend to swell in the armpits or the neck, or some of these regions where there are a lot of lymph nodes. And this is why it is called bubonic plague, because the word bubos was given to these swellings that would occur as it invaded the lymphatic system. Now, the bacterium, the bacillus, could also spread into the lungs, and here it becomes an airborne disease, the pneumonic plague. This is not a separate disease. It is the same bacterium. It's the same pathogen, but it's, in this case, spread via coughing and sneezing and the transfer of mucus. And it can also get into the bloodstream, which is called the septicemic version of the plague. Same disease, just a different part of the body that's affected. And these are, the bubonic plague probably has a mortality rate somewhere between 30 and 70% if it invades the lymph nodes. If it gets into the lungs, that goes up precipitously, probably to 90+%. The septicemic form of the plague is almost 100% mortality. If it gets into the blood, it causes the blood literally to clot in the veins, and you're going to die of blood clots and inadequate circulation. And so this is a terrible, terrible disease that takes many forms inside the body depending on which systems it invades. The main reason it's called the Black Death was that the septicemic form would cause bruising all over the body, especially in the extremities, as the blood would clot in the veins and get into the capillaries, and so in the tips of the fingers and the toes and places like that, the capillaries would burst, causing them to turn blue and black. It was called the blue fever by some during the Middle Ages. So apologies if you're getting grossed out by this. This really is a terrible, terrible disease. Now, what's more interesting, I think, for our purposes here is not the pathology, the medical aspects of this, but rather how the people of this period responded to the plague. And there's a lot we could say about this. When I teach the Middle Ages as upper division classes, I tend to delve quite a bit into sources on this. The one that you were assigned to read for this class was Giovanni Boccaccio. Sorry, I've got some other things pulled up here. Giovanni Boccaccio's introduction to the Decameron, which was written. Boccaccio wrote this set of stories. If you're familiar with the Canterbury Tales, written by Geoffrey Chaucer at the end of the 14th century, that's a set of stories. The narrative device for that is that there are a group of travelers, of pilgrims, going to the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury, and they meet up at an inn in just outside of London, and they decide to pass the time by telling each other stories. Right? That's the device for all of these separate tales that are told. Well, the Decameron is another series of stories, same kind of narrative device, But in this case, Giovanni Boccaccio, the Italian author who composed this, set it during the Black Death. And so you have this group of people who are fleeing the Black Death, trying to get out of the cities. They meet up in the countryside and decide to kind of distract themselves from all of the gloom and doom and horror going on around them by telling stories to each other, right? And so in the introduction to the Decameron, Boccaccio comments on the plague itself, and I think that this is one of the best sources for understanding the kinds of responses that people had to this disease, right? So he begins by saying 1,348 years had passed since the fruitful incarnation of the Son of God, when there came into the noble city of Florence, that's Boccaccio's home, the most beautiful of all Italian cities, a deadly pestilence, which either because of the operations of the heavenly bodies or because of the just wrath of God mandating punishment for our iniquitous ways, several years earlier had originated in the Orient, that is the East, where it destroyed countless lives, scarcely resting in one place before it moved to the next, and turning westward in its strength grew monstrously. Now, just a couple comments on that. Notice that Boccaccio says, I don't know why this happened, right? There are different explanations for this. One of them is, as he says, the operations of the heavenly bodies. It was believed that the movements of the planets and the stars would have an impact on the Earth, that it would cause things like disease. And this is all part of the scientific explanation at the time. If you're smiling behind your hands or sort of laughing at the ignorance of people in the 14th century, you might do well to take some time to actually look at the way that they conceived of this. This was an understanding of the universe that persisted for many centuries, and many parts of which go all the way back to ancient Greece. The belief was that the world is composed of these four basic elements: earth, air, water, and fire, and that all things are made up of those basic building blocks, and that these are connected to things in the heavens. The whole, the whole kind of study of astrology and all of this is connected to this. If you're interested in ever reading your horoscope, that draws from this same notion of how the universe works. That the movements in the heavens affect people on the earth. Okay. And so if you're hearing some noise in the background, I'm filming this at my house, and I am right next to the train tracks, so hopefully that won't be too disturbing here. Okay. In any case, so, this may be caused by the stars or the planets being in an improper alignment, which would affect what's going on the Earth. Or, the most common explanation, of course, was that this is, as he says, the just wrath of God mandating punishment for our iniquitous ways. This is a punishment for sin, right? And so, this tells us that people were confused. They, of course, had a religious explanation for this, as well as a scientific one, at least according to the scientific principles of the time. And he does talk here about the pathological symptoms that, as he says, it began with swellings in the groin and armpit in both men and women, some of which were as big as apples and some of which were shaped like eggs. Some were small, others were large. And so, they've got these buboes, as we talked about earlier. Now, this third paragraph here is the one that I want to spend a little time on. Okay, this is we might say, the social and cultural response to the plague, right? Not everybody responded the same way. I think that people obviously felt a great deal of fear and trepidation, fear of death, fear of, annihilation as a species and all of that. But their responses did vary, as Boccaccio helps us to understand here. So he says, because of all these things, and many others that were similar or even worse, diverse fears and imaginings were born in those left alive, and all of them took recourse to the most cruel precaution to avoid and run away from the sick and their things. This is one of the things that authors from this period tend to focus on is that people abandoned even their loved ones. They often left them behind. If somebody got the plague, it was like, okay, well, it's been nice knowing you. You're going to die anyway, so I'm going to try to save my own life here by getting out of town, right? The whole setting for the Decameron is that these people have fled from Florence and they're out in the countryside. They meet up and decide to kind of lessen their fears by sharing these stories with each other. Okay, and so flight was one of the major responses to this. Okay, he continues by saying others were of the opinion that they should live moderately and guard against all excess. By this means they would avoid infection. Okay, so he says, having withdrawn, living separate from everybody else, they settled down and locked themselves in where no sick persons or any other living person could come. They ate small amounts of food and drank the most delicate wines and avoided all luxury, refraining from speech with outsiders, refusing news of the dead or the sick or anything else, and diverting themselves with music or whatever else was pleasant. Okay, and so there's this notion that if we just live a life of moderation or even a life of austerity, right? Take up the life of a hermit or a monk. Try to, defray or deflect the wrath of God by doing this. And some of this may have been born of religious understanding. Some of it may have been born of a kind of scientific understanding, but that was one of the major responses, okay? Others, he goes on to say, right, who disagreed with this, affirmed that drinking beer, enjoying oneself, and going around singing and ruckus raising and satisfying all one's appetites whenever possible, and laughing at the whole bloody thing was the best medicine. And these people put into practice what they heartily advised to others, day and night, going from tavern to tavern, drinking without moderation or measure, and many times going from house to house, drinking up a storm, and only listening to and talking about pleasant things, right? So people decided to party. And kind of go out with a bang, as it were, right? But of course, none of these responses did ultimately, lead. None of them were foolproof, I guess, is what I want to say. Some people, who lived the life of moderation ended up dead. Some people who, lived the life of partying ended up dead. Probably a lot of, both of those groups. Some people who fled ended up, the disease ended up catching up with them, right? None of these responses ultimately, satisfied fully as a kind of path to get away from the plague, right? So people became more and more desperate over time, it seems. Okay, so this is a map that shows the spread of the plague. There's one other response that I want to talk about, but I'll get to that in a minute here with an image. So you can see it, it enters Western Europe via Italy and the islands out here in the Western Mediterranean, coming from Constantinople. And then in 1348, it spread into Spain and France and all throughout Italy. And from there into, and even up to London, actually, by the end of 1348, there are cases in London. From there, further north through Germany and, down here through kind of Central and Eastern Europe, and all the way over here into Scandinavia and the Baltic region, right? The one place that it missed, it seems, was Poland. This is, I think, probably the one time in Poland's history that it escaped a major disaster, right? We might think about all of the wars that Poland has been involved in, all the way up to World War II, right? And the spread of communism into Poland and things like this. That Poland has often been victimized by great tragedy. I'm not sure that the Poles would necessarily agree with that characterization, but let's just go with it here anyway. But the authorities in Poland did a pretty good job of protecting their land by instituting strict quarantines, by closing borders, by policing effectively. The Polish lands were, it seems, missed by the plague, that it went right around them, and they were able to escape this somehow. Okay, but most people of Europe ended up affected by this, and all told, this probably killed upwards of a third, and in some areas maybe even half of the population of Europe, right? And that's just a shocking total. I mean, this would be like, having an outbreak of plague that killed 150 million people in the United States or something like that. This is just an insane mortality rate. And society, understandably, was transformed forever by this. The effects were long-lasting and profound and really definitive for the people of Europe for the next couple of centuries. The last response I want to talk about here was a common religious one, and it's one that really sort of comes out of the devotional trends in the Middle Ages, but represents we might say, a distortion of those. There were groups of people, probably lay persons, but maybe involving some clergy, who took to sort of traveling around from settlement to settlement, from town to town, and trying to suffer as Jesus suffered. So they would go into towns. You can see they had these uniforms. They have the imagery of the crucifix here. And this guy, in fact, not just him, but several of them are holding flails or whips, right? This is where the term flagellants comes from. The word flagella in Latin means whip, right? So these are people who would go into towns or villages and put on a show by beating themselves bloody in front of everyone else. This is a reenactment of the scourging and the crucifixion of Christ. And the message here is we need to suffer like Jesus did in order to sort of mitigate or to deflect the wrath of God, right? To make up for the sins that we have committed so that God will defray his punishment and will remove this plague from our midst. And it's not just that the flagellants themselves, responded this way. It's the responses to the flagellants that are doubly interesting. There are a number of sources that talk about how emotional these displays were. That people, would watch these things and would burst into tears. That this is just a tremendously powerful experience for them. But at the same time, the flagellants were considered criminals, even heretics. The institutional church cracked down on them, often rounding them up, arresting them, and in some cases even putting some of them to death. And so, they were not met with approval, certainly by the institutional church, yet at the same time they inspired a great deal of emotion. So this is a paradoxical kind of group. In some areas, the flagellants led massacres of Jews or other minorities who were often blamed for the plague. The Jews, it was rumored, were poisoning the wells. They didn't stop to notice that the Jews were drinking out of the same wells that everybody else was drinking out of, and they weren't spared the plague. They were dying, in large numbers as well. Jews were often the scapegoats, in this period for bad things. They were blamed, and much has happened during the Crusades, and at other moments in medieval European history, Jews were massacred in fairly large numbers. In fact, these were the largest massacres or pogroms, that's kind of the technical term, of Jews in the Middle Ages. And in many areas, Jews were simply driven out of the towns that they had inhabited for several centuries. This is one of the reasons why so many Jews end up in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and in the western part of Russia, by the early modern period, and why they're still there in the 20th century when the Nazis, of course, attacked Eastern Europe and ended up massacring them by the millions. So there's a lot more we could say about that. This is actually a research specialty of mine. But suffice it to say that the Jews were targeted here, and as has been the case in other parts of European history, Jews were victimized in tragic ways by the Black Death. Okay, at this point I would pause and ask if there are further questions about the Black Death. Feel free to ask those on a discussion board or something like that. Now, I want to move on to a second sort of theme from the 14th and 15th centuries. This is, as I said, an era of great transition and transformation, and one of the places that sees the greatest transformation is the institutional church, and even more particularly, more specifically, the papacy sees a lot of change in this period. Now, this change begins with a rivalry between the Pope who ruled at the end of the 13th century, Boniface VIII, and the French king, Philip IV, otherwise known as Philip the Fair. Philip IV was one of the most powerful, influential, and we might say creative and audacious rulers of the Middle Ages. And in a contest between two quite powerful personalities, Boniface the Pope and Philip the King, Philip was the one who decidedly emerged as the victor here. And his decisions would influence the course of European history for more than a century and really has an impact that reverberates much longer than that. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of details here. Okay. Suffice it to say that Boniface VIII was a pope in the mold of Gregory VII or Innocent III, two figures we have already talked about in this class, two very powerful popes who had an expansive vision of papal power. But by the end of the 13th century, the papacy no longer commanded the respect or the resources that it had in the 12th and 13th, or rather the late 11th and late 12th century, when Gregory and Boniface, or rather Gregory and Innocent respectively, were ruling. Boniface VIII did a number of things that really ticked people off, and not just kind of the kings who were, the targets of his opprobrium, but even clergy, in the case of Boniface, felt that he was overreaching. And some of this comes down to the loyalty of people in Europe, right? We've already seen contention between the crown heads of Europe and the Pope in the investiture controversy and some of these other instances. But at this moment in time, the Pope was not a terribly popular figure. And when he did some things that were considered kind of overreaching, Philip IV, who was a shrewd political operator, took advantage of that, right? So Philip, who was deeply in debt, he spent a lot of money growing his bureaucracy, his governing apparatus, paying for armies and things like that to increase his power and his hold on the kingdom. Being deeply in debt, he always was looking for further sources of revenue. Back to a theme I talked about a minute ago, one of the groups he targeted, in fact, was the Jews. In 1306, Philip exiled the Jews, told them that they were no longer welcome in France, and he seized all of their assets. Only a year or two after that, he would do the same with the Knights Templar, this group that had begun during the Crusades in Jerusalem and had spread throughout Europe. And the Knights Templar were highly involved in banking and credit systems in this period, and so they were quite wealthy. And Philip decided to disband the Templars and seize their assets, and he was able to get away with this, actually, largely because he had a bunch of trumped-up charges suggesting that the Knights Templar were engaged in heresy and all sorts of untoward behavior. And because he had bested the Pope, he was able to get away with that too. All right. So the beginning of this conflict between Philip and Boniface, Boniface already had a reputation for papal overreach, and Philip decided to levy taxes against the churches in France. Now, you might think that the clergy would be upset with this and would side with the Pope, but in fact, Boniface responded to this taxation levy by saying that the French king had absolutely no power, that all of his power was derived from the Pope, and that he was essentially the servant of the Pope. And many French clergy, not just nobles and laymen, but clergy, actually sided with Philip in this. They would rather pay taxes to the French king than be under the thumb of such a kind of megalomaniacal pope, right? Boniface did not read the situation well, and Philip was able to press his advantage when Boniface responded by sort of doubling down on his positions and even suggesting sort of universal power for the Pope. Philip decided to act when he received no opposition for this, really. He decided to act in even more bold ways. And so he marched an army down into Italy and arrested Boniface. And much as he did with the Knights Templar, he declared that Boniface was a heretic and a sexual deviant. I'm not sure how deviant he could have been. He was like 80 years old at the time. These charges sort of stuck, and Boniface, who was not in the greatest of health, was so shocked by this that he shortly thereafter took sick and died. Okay. Now, with the death of Boniface, this is all happening in the first, 3 or 4 years of the 14th century. I think Boniface died in, 1305, 1306, something like that. So they have to hold an election to decide who's going to be the next pope, right? Well, Philip still had armies in Italy, and a lot of the French clergy in particular had sided with Philip, and so he was putting a great deal of pressure on this papal election. And the College of Cardinals ended up electing a French cardinal who took the papal name of Clement V. And shortly after his election, Clement announced that he did not feel safe in Rome, given the contention between, the Italians who had sided with Boniface and the French who had sided with Philip. And so he announced that he was going to move his residence from Rome to the city of Avignon in what is now southeastern France, but at the time this was actually papal territory. These were lands controlled by the Pope. So it wasn't like he moved into France. He did move closer to lands that Philip controlled, which gave Philip greater access to this. All right. Now, from 1305, when Clement moved, death of Boniface, election of Clement, and the move to Avignon, until 1378, and in fact we're going to see even after that, the popes were resident in Avignon rather than in Rome. Okay, this is known historically as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, taking its name from the biblical episode when the Jews were taken captive by the Babylonians, and many of them were carried off to Babylon itself. Right, so this has nothing to do with the city of Babylon, but it's the name given to this whole period. All of the popes elected during this time were French. Now, the question is, were they totally under the thumb of the French kings? Well, there's no doubting the influence the French kings had on the papacy. Definitely Philip IV, was calling a lot of the shots here. But I think that, to say that would be to sort of overreach, in our historical interpretation. There were good reasons why the popes thought they should stay in Avignon. Rome itself was the site of a lot of corruption, murder and graft and things like this. Much like, was happening in late antiquity with the emperors. The popes did not feel comfortable in Rome in this period. However, this did give numerous parties occasion to criticize the papacy for being kind of the puppet of the French kings, right? you can see from this illustration here, which comes from a manuscript of the 14th century, that Rome, so this is a map of Rome, okay, with all of the major churches and things like that, that Rome is depicted as a widow wearing black, wearing mourning clothing. Mourning for what? Who was her dead husband? Well, of course, her dead husband is the Pope, right? The Pope is no longer there. She has been left behind. She's a widow. And here we have these noblemen who are sort of, have greedy expressions on their faces, looking at all of the sights of Rome and seeing what they can claim for themselves out of the carnage of the Avignon Papacy, right? And that captures, I think, the mood of the time here, all right? So does the Papal Palace at Avignon. This is an imposing structure. I visited there actually fairly recently, and it truly is quite imposing. You can see it's a fortress, and it was really built with a fortress mentality, right? The popes kind of hold themselves up there, trying to deflect criticism and to maintain their interests, and to, sort of escape from the opprobrium of both the Italian nobles and Italian cardinals, and probably to some extent from the French kings, right? They were adopting a sort of bunker mentality here for several decades in the 14th century. Now, things got worse before they got better. This is a poem written in that period, and I don't want to sort of belabor the point here too much, but I think this poem really captures, again, the kind of zeitgeist of the people in this period, at least insofar as it concerned the papacy. You see that, it talks about the Pope betraying his sacred trust, right? Because while the rich his grace can gain alway, his favors from the poor are aye withholden, right? So he only does things for rich people who can pay him and not for poor people. He sends he sends clowns and tramps. That would be the clergy who were supposed to be providing spiritual direction. They're clowns and tramps who crawl, vending his pardon briefs from cot to hall, letters and pardons worthy of the writer. And so, the papacy is really just out for money here, and they're not concerned at all with the spiritual direction of the people of Christendom at this point. And it's not just the Pope, but each cardinal, as it says, is after the same thing, and the same thing with the bishops, right? So it's, the corruption goes from the top to the bottom of the church here, right? But none of these people are worthy or interested in anything but lining their own pockets, right? I think that this is probably just as inaccurate as a portrayal as one that would sort of champion the papacy in this period. But this is the sentiment that was expressed not just by this author, but by numerous people in this period. We can see the criticism mounting over time. Okay, as I said, it gets worse before it gets better. In the year 1377, Gregory XI, still a French pope, decides to go back to Rome. Decides that the Avignon period has had a very deleterious impact on the papacy. He's got to make a change here. So he goes back to Rome and tries to set up shop in Rome again. But shortly after that, he dies. Literally weeks after he returns to Rome, he dies. And the Italian cardinals decide to sort of seize the opportunity by holding a hasty election, and they put a lot of pressure on the other cardinals to elect an Italian pope this time. And so there's a new Italian pope, but the French cardinals cried foul. They returned to Avignon and held their own election. And so now there are two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon, okay, both of whom had powerful supporters. So the Italian nobles and Italian cardinals were great supporters of the Italian pope. The French king and French nobles are great supporters of the French pope. During this time, the French kings were involved in a war with the English, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes here. And so the English were also supporting the Italian Pope. And there was an alliance between some of the French kings and some of the German nobles. So there were German supporters of the French, and there were Spanish supporters. And anyway, there were supporters, very powerful supporters on both sides. So neither pope saw any necessity of stepping down. And so for about 30 years, from 1377 or 1378, I can't remember when Gregory XI died, but until the beginning of the 15th century, there were two popes. Okay. Now, the question is, how do you solve this, right? The Pope claims to be the supreme religious authority in Christendom, in fact, in the whole world. Both of these popes claim that power. Neither of them was willing to give pride of place to the other pope or to anybody else. And so there were some who began to theorize in Europe that the only way they could contravene the wishes of a ruling pope was to call a council of bishops and other leaders of the church. There was, of course, precedent for this. There had been councils in the early church and kind of all throughout the Middle Ages. And so these theorists decided to hold a council. They met in the Italian city of Pisa in 1409. And they decreed that both the Roman Pope and the Avignon Pope were deposed, and they elected a new pope, Benedict XIII. I think Alexander III was the Avignon Pope, and Gregory XII was the Roman Pope. I may have these mixed up, but so they elect Benedict XIII. But neither Alexander nor Gregory agreed to step down. And both of them had powerful supporters, and so Benedict's papacy never left Pisa. We now have three popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, and one in Pisa. Okay, all with supporters, all of whom claim to be the legitimate pope, right? And for another 8 years, there were three popes, right? Well, at this point, this whole Avignon thing, this whole messed up papacy has gone on for more than a century, and so many people in Europe were just fed up with this. There were groups that had emerged that declared that all of the popes were the minions of the devil. There, a lot of talk about the Pope as the Antichrist and things like this in this period. So some people were leaving the church and kind of going off and doing their own religious thing at this point. And so, the council proponents finally had their way. In the year 1417, actually it began a little bit before that, but the major decisions were made in 1417. They held another council, this one in Constance, what is now Switzerland, on the shores of Lake Constance there. They deposed all three popes and elected a new pope, Martin V. And in this case, the decree that came out with this, known as Haec Sancta, ended up being accepted by pretty much every powerful entity in Europe. The French kings went along with this. The English kings went along with this. Two of the three previous popes agreed to step down. I think it was Benedict XIII who was the only one who did not go along with this, and he ended up kind of exiled off to Spain, where all the way to the end of his life he still claimed to be the legitimate pope, but nobody really listened to him. And the Council of Constance finally ended this whole thing. I will say briefly that the ones arguing for councils as the supreme authority in Christendom at this point were quite innovative philosophically and politically. They're some of the most important political theorists in this period. And it's these conciliar theorists, in fact, who began to write about things like natural rights that would, of course, be picked up, or rather would continue to develop and be picked up by figures like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes, and eventually Thomas Jefferson in the 17th and 18th centuries. We find the kind of first stirrings of this notion of natural rights in the writings of the conciliar theorists in the late Middle Ages. So they're important for a number of reasons here. Okay. Now, one of the kind of long-lasting results of this whole catastrophe of the papacy in this period is a legacy of disenchantment and opposition. The people were fed up with the church. We can see some of this anti-clerical opinion in writings like Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. There's a figure in England in the 14th century named John Wycliffe who sort of forms his own group and speaks out against the papacy. Wycliffe was the inspiration for another group in the early 15th century called the Hussites in Bohemia, or what is now the Czech Republic. And figures like Wycliffe and Huss are seen as forerunners of the Protestant Reformation. I hesitate to draw too directly a line from those two to say Martin Luther, but the trends are definitely going in that direction already in this period. Ideas that the papacy is a problem rather than a solution, and that would persist and grow over time. Okay. Now, last point I want to make, or last theme I want to discuss here in this lecture, is that the late Middle Ages was also a time of intense and fairly constant warfare. We could call this another human disaster, right? And the most famous and long-lasting, definitely long-lasting, and arguably most influential of all the wars in this period was the 100 Years' War between the English and the French. And it was fought over English territorial claims to lands in France. If you recall, the English kings had held lands in France from the time of William the Conqueror, who was, of course, the Duke of Normandy up here before he was the King of England. And when he went to England, he did not renounce his claims in Normandy and continued to be the Duke of Normandy. And in the succeeding generations, the Dukes of Normandy / Kings of England married into other noble families in France, to the point that under the reign of Henry II in the second half of the 12th century, the English kings held fully like half of France as their own territory. Philip II, the French king at the end of the 12th century, managed to wrest much of that land away from the English kings, but those claims were still there in the early 14th century. And the powerful King Edward III ended up attacking France starting in the late 1330s. And through the use of new military innovations, especially the longbow, which was a peasant's weapon, but it was tremendously effective on the battlefield. Okay, longbowmen tended to be peasants, tended to be woodsmen in particular. Many of them Welsh in the service of the English king. But they could fire arrows from, in some cases, like 200 or 300 yards away that would pierce the chainmail that was worn by the French knights. French nobility, in other words, were brought down by arrows cast from the longbows of peasants. And in the Battle of Crécy in the year 1346, and again in the Battle of Poitiers, all the way down here you see Poitiers is right there, Crécy is up in northern France. With these two battles, Poitiers in 1356, the English longbowmen took down hundreds of French knights. The French really didn't figure this out, didn't sort of account for the skill of the English longbowmen, and the flower of French chivalry was cut down in these battles, and this led to some sort of internal strife in the French kingdoms in the aftermath of the Black Death, in particular, which was right in the midst of all of this. There was an uprising of peasants in 1358, known as the Jacquerie uprising, and so France was kind of a mess in this period. After the death of Edward III, though, the French managed to regroup, and the English began to suffer from internal weakness. There was a massive peasants' revolt in 1381, known as the Wat-Tyler revolts in England. This was put down by the English nobles and the English royalty, but not before it did a great deal of damage to the economy and the reputation of England. There was a rival house to the ruling dynasty, the House of Lancaster, that rose up in this period, and this would lead eventually to the Wars of the Roses, as they're called, in the 15th century between the houses of Lancaster and York. These, by the way, were the inspiration for George Martin's Game of Thrones series of books. That he kind of took the Wars of the Roses and set them in a fantasy setting, right? So if you're into Game of Thrones, either the books or the TV series, you can maybe appreciate the situation that England was in the late Middle Ages. Under the reign of Henry V in the early 15th century, the English regrouped and once again pressed their advantage, winning, for instance, in 1415 the Battle of Agincourt, and eventually taking over much of northern France, including Paris. And the reigning King Charles VII, in the, I guess it's around 1420 or so, let me think about this, in the 1420s, ended up declaring that the son of Henry III would be the next king of France. In other words, that the crowns of England and France would be joined together, right? He was forced to sort of renounce, or rather to dethrone or to take away the claim to the throne of his son, Charles VII, the Dauphin, as he was known, right? The heir to the throne, okay? Now, it's right around this time, 1430, 1431, that one of the more remarkable figures in all of European history emerges. This was a peasant girl known as Joan of Arc. She was from a little village in Champagne over here, actually in territory that was at the time held by the English and by their allies, the Dukes of Burgundy, down here, right? So the English held all of this territory up here in northern France. Charles VII had a court down here in south of Orleans, so the line that the French held was sort of right here, and the English were pressing their advantage. They had besieged the city of Orleans. And the king was down here in Bourges or someplace like that. But if the English broke through and took Orleans, that was the major stronghold that was holding, sort of their armies back. And if they were able to do this, they probably would have taken over the rest of France. Well, Joan of Arc went to the court of Charles VII, claiming that she had had visions where these various saints had appeared to her. St. Michael, St. Margaret, St. Catherine, and had told her, simple peasant girl, like 17 years old, that she should free her country from the English. Now, was Joan crazy? Was she truly inspired? Was she sent from God? All of this, there was some really kind of, at least by modern standards, bizarre stuff happening with Joan. So she goes to the court of Charles VII, the Dauphin, and convinces him to let her go to battle. Okay, the process of convincing him is quite interesting. There are numerous film depictions of this, but I'm not going to go into details here. You can look into that yourselves if you're so inclined. Anyway, Joan ends up going off to Orleans, donning armor, which was specially made for her, and fighting in the siege of Orleans. And she was really quite an effective battlefield commander, it seems. She led a couple of raids on the English positions, and through her efforts, combined with the efforts of the French troops, they were able to lift the siege of Orleans, to force the English to retreat. And from there, Joan continued to join battle with the English until she was captured a few months after her campaign began. She was put to trial and executed for heresy and witchcraft. If you read the accounts of her trial, you'll see that she was one of the things that the court was most concerned about was that she was wearing men's clothing, and that she refused to do that, or she refused to rather put on women's clothing. This was probably a practical consideration for Joan, given that she was held in prison. She was probably afraid of being, sexually harassed and sexually violated, raped, and so it was a practical consideration for her. The trial of Joan of Arc is really interesting, kind of fascinating reading, so I'd recommend looking into this again if you're so inclined. Joan it wasn't so much her military contribution as what she became, a symbol for the French that inspired them. And over the next 20 years or so, the French gradually retook the land that they had lost. Charles was able to go up to the traditional site of the crowning of the French kings, the city of Reims here in eastern France, in Champagne, and be crowned as king. And under his reign, the French pushed the English back all the way to Calais here, and pretty much out of every other territory they held. By 1453, the English had lost all of their territory in France except for the port of Calais itself. And so, this war, lasted for 116 years. It wasn't like they fought all during that period, but it is, Shakespeare certainly was interested in the 100 Years' War, and in fact wrote, Henry V is probably his most famous play about it. But this was still, the effects were still sort of reverberating for, in Shakespeare's day, which was more than 100 years after this. The effects of the war in the short and long term are significant, right? The English kings were forced time and again to go back to the nobles asking for more money to prosecute the war on the continent. And this led to the strengthening of Parliament in England, which had Parliament had first been called in the 13th century, first been organized, I should say, in the 13th century. Some kings, like Edward I, had worked with Parliament effectively. Others had really fought against Parliament. But Parliament becomes the governing council of England in the 100 Years' War period. Even though the king still held a great deal of power, they had to work together with Parliament if they wanted to get anything done effectively. On the other hand, the French kings grew in power during this period, and this led to a sort of trend of absolutism that we will see realized in the early modern period. By the 17th century, the French kings were ruling as absolute monarchs. The greatest manifestation of that, of course, was Louis XIV. But discussing Louis would take us beyond the scope of this course. Okay. One of the things that we don't maybe tend to think about when we talk about the 100 Years' War is the human cost. Both the English and French use mercenary armies. Mercenary armies, of course, want the war to continue because if it continues, they get paid, right? And so mercenary armies would tend to do things that would keep the war going, like raid towns and villages, killing peasants, seizing their food stocks, committing all kinds of atrocities, raping women in mass numbers, killing or torturing peasants. The human cost is not something that we tend to get from the sources because peasants, of course, were illiterate. They weren't writing down their experiences, but we can assume from some descriptions of this and certainly from similar wars that are fought later on that the human cost must have been terrible, that a lot of people suffered from this war. At the same time, this war changed warfare forever. From the time of Charles Martel, who we discussed earlier in the course, until the 100 Years' War, warfare was largely about the strength of the cavalry. And the cavalry was made up of wealthy nobility who could afford to outfit themselves with armor and horses and all of the things necessary for a strong cavalry. The cavalry in the Hundred Years' War were cut down by the artillery, by the longbows, by the crossbows. They called these weapons, unnatural and devilish. They even tried to have them banned. One famous history book, Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror, which is about the 14th century, even sort of draws a parallel between the longbow and the crossbow in the 14th century and the atomic bomb in the 20th century, that the responses were similar, right? That these weapons are too destructive to be used, that they ought to be banned, that no one should ever use these things. Certainly if longbowmen were caught by the French nobles, they would be tortured, and their fingers would be cut off so they could no longer fire the longbow, and things like this. In any case, ultimately the artillery proved to be the decisive force in these battles. And even in this period, we see the beginning of the use of gunpowder. Gunpowder weapons, cannons and guns and things like that. That will become the norm, of course, in the 15th and 16th centuries. A well-stocked infantry with pikes and perhaps with gunpowder weapons will ultimately become the main fighting force in European warfare, really all the way till the 20th century, and arguably all the way to the present, although, of course, weapons and styles and things like that change. Now, this means that the nobility, the ones who justified their elevated position and their outsized wealth by the fact that they were the ones who did the fighting, no longer were able to justify their existence along those lines. They had to come up with new justifications for the power that they continued to wield. And they would do that, and this evolution of the nobility is one of the major themes of the early modern period from the 15th to the 18th centuries. Okay, I think that's it. I'm going to start to talk about the Renaissance in the next lecture, which will be the concluding one of this course. So, thank you.